So this is a project that I first started on, made the first few at least 6 years ago from the date tag that I put on this one. May have been 7. This wasn't the first one I made, this is one we've kept. In hindsight, the the oldest boy was a little bit too young still to have a step stool to reach a sink. You know, I thought it's time to start teaching him to wash his hands, and being able to reach the sink would certainly help a lot versus us having to hold him up every time. But he was a bit wobbly at first, so he was probably a year and a half, 2 years old, and that was probably a little early, so you might keep that in mind. Maybe 3 or 4 is a better age to start here. But I didn't have a whole lot of tools at the time, so I was kind of limited as to what I could do. And I just kind of looked around online to see if I could find any good plans. I could find plenty of pictures, but not any real good dimension data. So I took one of his shoes and just kind of guesstimated, looked at it, measured some of the cabinet height and everything. Obviously his shoe was quite a bit smaller back then. But I thought I'd start out by kind of showing you the dimensions, and then I'll talk about how I built the early ones with very limited tools. You could really do this with just a jigsaw, and everything else is optional. Maybe a couple clamps, but anyway, as far as major tools, a jigsaw would be all you would need to make a very simple one. And it's obviously sturdy enough. I mean, this one here is already 6 years old, 2 kids of abuse. They drag it all over the house, out in the yard, they beat on it, it gets wet in the bathroom. So, for dimensions here, we'll turn this around a bit. And this yardstick may be a little bit easier to read. I'm a total of 13 inches wide, or I guess this would be deep, probably a better way to put it. And I'm going to measure just up to the top here because it's a 3/4 inch piece of pine for the step, so you'll know 3/4 inch taller than the measurement here. That's 15 inches to the top of the side. This step is 10 inches, and this one's 5. And then width, we're 4 inches for the first step, another 4 inches for the second step, and then 5 inches on the back. And then actual width here, total width at 10.5 inches. So these cross braces are 9 inches inside to inside. So plus 3/4 and 3/4, another 1.5 inches, gives us 10.5. So what I did initially with these, this was just cheap pine, like you can get at the home stores. And if you go in and look, you can kind of cherry pick. This is not ultra strong, not ultra dense. This is fast growth, not old growth. It's just plain old, probably southern yellow pine. Some of it, I think one batch had a tag imported from Scandinavia. But look for one with some character. What might be considered rejects in other applications, I thought actually gave this quite a bit of character here. So for the sides, you can't buy a board that wide. So just a couple of these, and cut it down, glue them together, clamp it, and edge joint it, and then you've then got a rectangle. Here's a cardboard template that I cut out at one time for tracing. And you can see it basically fits right there. But if we were to imagine this is my glued up rectangle, then just come back with the jigsaw, cut that out, and then on the bottom here, I used a jigsaw there as well, and cut that out. As far as coming up with the curve, initially it was a paint can or something other with a round shape. You know, I sat there, drew the curve, and then connected the line between. I've since just saved a cutout from one of them and used that to trace. Makes it a little bit easier. With glue up on the initial designs, I actually just made a square, you know, butts up right there, and then the steps sit down on top. One here, one front and back on the top step, and then a cross brace that I just spaced in a few inches and a few inches up. And you know, we don't want to be down in the curve area, we want to be up a little ways from that. And I used an 18 gauge brad nailer, which I realize we're talking a simple project, you may not have a nail gun. It's kind of tough to drive those small finishing nails. You could do that. You might try pre-drilling if you're going to do that. You could, especially if you were going to paint it, use screws, just countersink them, fill it with wood putty. That would work too. A lot of it depends on your clamping and what you've got access to. It can all be put together without any hardware. Mostly those are just kind of clamping while that glue dries. They do add some strength, of course, especially if I don't have a tight square joint, which is an issue. I don't have a joiner or a single edge planer. I do have a very low end planer so that I could plane these boards, you know, true and flat. But I didn't even have to use that. Most of what you're looking at in the store, if you cherry pick your boards, will work well enough. Then on these cuts, this is just a standard 1x2. So all you have to do for these cross runners is cut them to length. You don't have to trim width. Kind of time went on, and I got to think about what am I going to get people for Christmas, and saw how much the kids liked it. I thought, you know what? Maybe my sister needs one for her kids. Okay, and then my other sister needs one. Now my brother and sister-in-law need one. Now my cousin needs one. Now the grandparents need one for when the kids are down there. Now the other grandparents need one. Hey, one of my coworkers has a kid about the same age as mine, and we're pretty good buddies. You know what? I'll make one for him. So I bet I've made at least 20 of these, probably closer to 30. I've made a few design changes that for me made it easier and cheaper. But if you were looking to just make one, you know, for your kid, grandkid, niece, nephew, what have you, you're probably talking about $20. I mean, give or take. If you've got just some basic tools, those dimensions seem to work pretty well. Nobody's had any real complaints about them. A couple of changes I made were maybe to make it a little stronger, make it a little easier to assemble if I'm trying to turn these out in any kind of numbers, and to make it look a little better. You know, most people are going to be so impressed that you made anything that they're not going to see the imperfections or, you know, how shoddy your craftsmanship is. One reason I'm not actually showing a build video here is there's a ton of woodworking porn out there on YouTube. Guys that have a lot better tools than me, even girls, and a lot better skills as well. So you could see them use the tools, and it looks a whole lot better than me. But so a couple of things that happened after I started making a whole lot more of these. There's a company not too far down the road from me that makes custom wood bed inserts for the classic pickups, you know, the ones that had the wooden floor in the bed. And they sell their scrap, buy a pretty fair sized pallet for like $50. And this is a lot denser. Instead of being southern yellow pine, this is like premium grade white pine from up north. It's not quite as dense as oak, but it's noticeably heavier, denser, stronger. It is a little more difficult to cut. Especially if you're cutting with a jigsaw, how you tend to get blade deflection at the bottom. You will notice that a whole lot more in the harder wood. But for the price, that certainly makes it a little more feasible than, you know, $15 to $20 per stool kind of adds up when you're making them for a lot of people and giving them as gifts. So if I can get a whole pallet of this and turn out, you know, 30, 40 stools for $50 worth of material, that's pretty good. Something else I got to thinking about is how those runners go here, and hopefully this will show in the light. What I've done is notched out at each location here, and that greatly increases my glue surface area. So not only do I have a square joint there sitting you know, vertically, also horizontally back here I've got that large area. One of the problems butting up inside here is that we're doing in grain to side grain for our glue joint, and this is quite small at 1.5 inches, so it's already a small joint, and we're also making one of the weakest glue points there. This also makes assembly quite a bit easier when I set the sides up. If I just clamp and hold the sides up, it's real easy to set in there with the glue and just sit and then hit it with a couple of small nails, and it stays pretty well. There are some downsides to this approach in that there's a lot more cutting, especially if you had to cut this with a jigsaw with that blade deflection, whether you had this face down or this side face down. Cutting that out, you're going to end up with that bevel there, and that's not going to sit totally flat or square in that joint. But well, if I break this into 3 pieces, I can cut these notches on the table saw before I glue up the side. But what I do with that, and it's quite easy if you're making these in batches, cut a bunch of backs, a bunch of middles, and a bunch of fronts. And I actually had some blowout, some chip out on this one. I should have had a backer board. I had a stack of these and just shoved them on through all at once. And for glue up, I made just a simple little jig here. I can glue them, set this down on the clamps, and run a couple clamps across there, and they'll fit down in there nice and square. And so then I don't have to come back and make all these cuts with a jigsaw. And to keep it from sticking, because you're going to have some glue seepage underneath, you could either put down some wax paper, or what I've done on this is just take some paste wax. It doesn't have to be this brand, but paste wax around that glue area where you're never going to have seep, and that'll stop the sticking. As far as overall strength of this stool, you know, really it's for kids. It's not meant for adult use. Of all the ones I've made, I'm only aware of 2 failures. The first one was a coworker buddy of mine. He's maybe not quite as tall as me, but got to be pretty close, and he's a stout guy, so he's well over 200 pounds. He's beefcake. And he was actually using it for himself, and I think it was one of the early ones where the seam was somewhere right here in the middle. It actually split the wood right down there, and he didn't fall. You know, it collapsed down underneath him, but he kept his balance. He didn't fall and get hurt. So probably not a design defect or material defect as much as overloading, not using for the intended purpose. But the second failure was one of these later designs, and one of the downsides to this is I have the seam right there and the seam right there. So those are going to be really, if glued properly, the glue is going to be stronger than surrounding wood, but a lot like welding, you'll tend to see material failure immediately around that area, not necessarily at the joint itself. So this is just a very small glue area here. If we were to look at that, I mean, we're going to be a little bit shy of 3.5 inches. And you could probably do something with changing this curve a bit to make that a little taller, or maybe even raising this first step to give you a little more room there. What I did, attempting to address this, I don't have any actually in use yet, this would be the first one, is putting a biscuit in there. And there's not a whole lot of room to put a biscuit, but there's certainly plenty, and that should greatly increase the surface area of that joint. So hopefully that adds enough strength without weakening the surrounding area from that material removal. So if you've got a router, it's great being able to round over the edges. In fact, if I grab one of the other ones, you can see nice soft edges all the way around. And that's pretty easy to do on the steps before you glue them on. And you can see I left just a little bit of overhang all 3 sides and flush in the back. Rounded through here, rounded here, on the edges of the brace. Completely optional. I mean, it's always a good idea to soften any edge like that, if a kid falls on it. But you could do this with a sander. You could do it by hand. With the sanding block, it would just take a long time. But if you're limited on tools and you're only making one, I mean, it's not that bad. But if you've got a round over bit on a sander, that's great. If you had a belt sander and you're good at freehand, you could take them over there and do it that way. And for finish, most all of them I just put clear polyurethane on, paying special attention to the feet on the bottom, because with kids and splashing, there's a good chance it's going to be in a bathroom with a tile floor and there's going to be some moisture down there. And one thing we know about wood is it's going to, depending on species, how porous it is and how those grain pores open up. Some of them can really wick up moisture, and that would cause swelling and cracking, or just rotting and decay down here. I didn't really stain any of them because stain is really good about exposing surface defects. Pine in particular has a very uneven grain with the varying pitch or wood oils content in the wood. You think about pine tar, it's oil, but all woods have an oil. And so you'll get real uneven, blotchy colors. If it's not perfectly smooth, you'll have an uneven, just ugly looking pattern, and I think the bare wood was a lot better. Painting is a lot more forgiving on cheaper wood. So I want to show you one of the other ones I made. And this one I actually did the sides in the pine. sticking with the same design as this one, where I've notched out those cross braces, and then there's my seams. And you can see a hint of the seam right there if you look close, and right there if you look close, and you can obviously see where the cross braces butt up. But then I did the steps in oak. And one thing unique on this one, I did a couple of them this way. Because of the way that's notched out there, I didn't use any hardware at all in assembling this. No screws, no nails, no metal. It's nothing but wood. I did run a dowel back here into the sides, and I actually stopped short so that it doesn't protrude, which can certainly be done. It just takes a little measuring to do that, to make sure you get enough depth without getting too much and busting through the other side. This one I just had to be real careful with clamping on. And so I got the base built like this. I painted the sides, was careful to leave the top edge there unpainted. And then when I clear coated the oak steps, I actually took the time to tape them off so that I left my glue surface, glued them on and clamped them. I've got a date on this one, 2014, so it's a few years old now. The paint has definitely taken some wear from the boys, especially back here, where they banged it and bruised it. One of the challenges working with a hardwood is any wood's going to swell and contract based on humidity, and that's kind of, and temperature, and that's kind of natural and normal. Soft woods like pine, balsa, we all know from school science experiments, is very flexible, a whole lot of elasticity. But your harder woods don't have that. They will tend to crack. And with everything clamped down and glued down so well, there could have been a minor crack in this to start with under the surface. But you can see here that has started to crack. And if there was any give in this design with that hardwood, it probably would not have cracked, or not cracked to that degree. But if that's the worst thing that happens to it, I can live with that. So on this one, I went ahead and ran a dowel pin all the way through. What I don't have is a mortising jig, and I really think that would be almost an easier, better way to go. Cut a tenon on this piece, square, rectangular hole, and have it shoved through. As far as the steps go, all around them, and I have a couple of them cut. These are the larger top steps. They're obviously too big for the bottom. But I've got a few cut for the different stools here, and we can see that this one's cupped pretty bad. You can see the wobble. This one was even worse, if that'll show up on the camera. I don't think that's going to be a huge deal breaker for this, really, for the intended purpose. I mean, this is not a fine curio cabinet going in a country club. I'm just going to put the cup facing downward because that gave me less wobble. And we're going to have a little gap down here, but we're going to have plenty of surface glue area along here, along the back. Plus the pins in it, it's going to be plenty strong anyway. I'll just have to make sure that I mark this top so that I round over the correct edge. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to these. Somebody with better tools and better skills would probably be more interesting to watch if they made an actual video of cutting, assembling, measuring, all that. But just wanted to throw out some ideas. This can be done really with just a couple of simple tools. Probably want some clamps for edge joining. Glue up is probably the longest amount of time you'll have to spend on this. A lot of the glues will say clamp for at least 30 minutes, but a couple hours is probably better. You could glue one evening after work, leave it sit overnight till you get home, glue the second one the next night, and then throw it all together the third night. But that's probably the single biggest piece of time here. Everything else is kind of optional how you want to do it. You could scale up the dimensions, scale them down, make some minor adjustments there. You can do the side in 2 pieces, you can do it in 3. You could even run the seam this way, that would be fine too. To me it looks better with the grain running vertically versus horizontally. But I did, for fitment of some boards I had, I know there was at least one of them that I did run a horizontal grain, and it held up just fine. Initially just making one because I realized, hey, this would be a whole lot cooler for my kids to have than one of those store-bought plastic ones. And hopefully it's something that they can give to their kids and say, yep, Grandpa made that. I really didn't have any intentions of making this many of them, but now there'll be another relative at some point who says, hey, can you make me one of those? Can you make me one of those? Okay, well, when I get time, I'll get to it. You know, if you're just making one or two of these, you can stick with a simple design and have it put together in really a couple hours total work time, and have something that hopefully your kids or your grandkid or your niece or nephew will be able to use for years and maybe even give to their own kids. So, hope that gives you some ideas, and you know, you don't have to be Norm Abram here to make some pretty decent woodwork. There are a lot of guys on YouTube that it almost intimidates you seeing the setup they've got and the skill level that they've got. But if you stick to some of these simpler projects that are, you know, practical use, it's a confidence builder for sure. It's also I don't know, it can inspire others, and hopefully, you know, your kids, when they look back, they remember, oh yeah, Mom and Dad made that for me, or, you know, aunt or uncle or who, whatever. So hopefully you enjoyed the video, and let me know what you think. I might be a little remiss if I don't at least mention why you see so many three-legged stools. After I made the first one, I found out quickly why. Is a three-legged stool is always even on the legs. There's no wobble in it. And this is tough here because, you know, my router table isn't perfect with my insert here. This is a bit higher here in the center on that piece. So you need a good flat surface or a good flat board and set it down and see if you've got any wobble. It sure looks like there's no wobble in it, like it came out perfect, but I guarantee you it's probably not. So expect maybe a little wobble, and it's not that difficult to fix. If I get it in a spot here where it wobbles, and let's just assume this is my flat surface and I've got some wobble. Here is my short leg. I can see by pushing down, it wobbles down on it. Pretty easy to address. You can just take a sander or a rasp to a leg to shorten it. So I could do two different ways to approach this. If this is my short leg, I can also shorten the opposite front leg, and that'll bring both fronts down, or both sides of the front down, and then it'll sit flat. The other way I could do it is attack the other leg here in the back on the same side as the short leg, and shorten that, and that'll lean it all over this way. And we're talking ever so slight. I mean, if you had a completely level surface and you put a level up here, no more than you would have to take off to take that wobble out. You wouldn't even notice the bubble move. But that's the quick, easy way to address the wobble, and then appreciate why all those step stools that were made years ago by hand were only three-legged.